Millions cried when Kevin and Winnie didn't end up together in the series finale, praising it as a beautiful, tragic message about first love. But you were completely lied to. ABC killed the Wonder Years overnight to bury a dark secret, a severe sexual harassment lawsuit aimed directly at their teenage golden boy, Fred Savage. Instead of protecting the female crew member he abused, the network paid hush money, silenced the victim, and abruptly pulled the plug on a billion-dollar empire. They weaponized America's purest television romance to launder a highly toxic workplace, turning your genuine tears into the ultimate corporate cover-up. How does a massive television network end up running a panic room to protect a teenager? The answer lies in the exact cultural landscape of 1988. The late 80s was a period of rapid social change, and the American public was craving comfort. The television network recognized this massive market demand and decided to build a highly profitable time machine. They created a program set in the late 1960s, designed to look back at suburban childhood through a warm lens. To make this billion-dollar nostalgia machine work, the network needed a specific face. They needed a boy who could represent the absolute innocence of the middle class. They found that face in a young actor named Fred Savage. When Fred was cast as Kevin Arnold, the network public relations team immediately went to work. They molded him into the ultimate golden boy. He had wide, sincere eyes and an incredibly earnest delivery. The camera loved him, and the audience trusted him instantly. But the television industry is fundamentally ruthless, especially when it comes to children. When a child actor is suddenly elevated to the status of a national icon, the traditional boundaries of childhood are completely destroyed. The moment Fred proved he could generate millions of dollars in advertising revenue, the corporate system stopped treating him like a normal boy. They started treating him like a highly valuable corporate asset. This is where the psychological trauma of the child star begins. It is not just about working long hours under hot studio lights. It is about a complete and terrifying reversal of authority. In a normal environment, adults set the rules and children follow them. On a highly profitable television set, the child generates the paychecks for hundreds of adult crew members. The directors, the producers, and the network executives quickly realize that their own financial survival depends entirely on keeping the child star happy. They stop saying no. They stop enforcing discipline. They grant the young star dangerous privileges. This environment breeds a deeply toxic sense of entitlement. From the very first days on the soundstage, the foundation was being laid for a massive power imbalance. Fred Savage was being taught by the adult system that he was untouchable, but a single boy is not enough to sustain a billion-dollar television empire. The network needed a compelling narrative hook to keep the audience invested week after week. They needed an emotional anchor to soften the show. In 1989, they found the perfect counterpart in Danica McKellar. She was cast as the girl next door, Winnie Cooper. The introduction of Danica changed the entire trajectory of the program and the lives of the two young actors. The writers focused heavily on the first awkward stirrings of young romance between Kevin and Winnie. The dynamic between Fred and Danica on screen was undeniable. When they shared their first clumsy kiss in the woods, It created an absolute media frenzy. The chemistry between them became the central pillar of the entire corporate enterprise. The audience watched their awkward hand-holding and their nervous conversations, and they fell completely in love with the illusion. This is the exact moment the collective hallucination began. The viewing public and the entertainment press actively convinced themselves that the actors were exactly like the characters they played. Because Fred and Danica looked so innocent on the television screen, the public unilaterally decided they must be perfect children in real life. The audience blurred the line between reality and fiction. The executives at the network watched this public reaction and realized they had been handed the ultimate corporate shield. The absolute purity of the romance was not just good television. It was used as a weapon by the public relations department. The network heavily promoted Fred and Danica together, putting them on magazine covers and setting up wholesome interviews. They sold the public a flawless image of innocent youth. Danica McKellar, with her quiet professionalism, inadvertently became the perfect anchor for this massive illusion. Her presence on the screen validated Fred's character, making him look even more sensitive and caring. Together, they formed a highly lucrative facade. However, behind that heavily guarded facade, the reality of the sound stage was beginning to shift. The media and the public were completely blinded by the romance. Because everyone was looking at the golden illusion, absolutely nobody was looking at the psychological pressure building right behind the cameras. Danica was a young girl from a working-class background who deeply valued the opportunity and the steady income. She treated the job with absolute seriousness. She learned her lines, hit her marks, and respected the adult crew members. She assumed that if she did her job perfectly, the system would treat her fairly. She did not yet understand that the system was entirely rigged to protect the boy standing next to her. As Fred began to test his boundaries, realizing that the adult directors would never shout at him or correct his bad behavior, his attitude shifted. The extreme financial pressure placed on his young shoulders by the network was immense. He was carrying the weight of a massive corporation, and the adults around him offered no psychological support, only demands for higher ratings. This pressure did not make him humble. It made him highly aggressive and protective of his status. Danica found herself standing directly in the blast zone of this emerging ego. The scripts demanded that she look at him with absolute adoration. She had to hold his hand and play the role of the perfect, supportive first love. But as soon as the director yelled cut, she had to navigate the reality of a teenage boy who was rapidly learning that he owned the building they were standing in. The network executives needed Danica to be flawless because her flawless image on screen effectively masked Fred's growing entitlement off-screen. The trauma for Danica was not born from a single violent event. It was the slow, crushing realization that she was entirely alone. She was part of the most famous couple on television, yet she had absolutely no real power. The network tied her career success directly to her ability to hide his flaws. Every time the press asked her about her wonderful co-star, she had to smile and recite the corporate script. She was forced to manufacture a beautiful romance with a boy who was completely out of control. knowing that if she ever complained, the adults in charge would simply replace her to protect their star. The system forced a teenage girl to manage the emotional fallout of a corrupted teenage boy, all while selling a billion-dollar lie to the public. By 1991, the physical reality of the actors began to change. Fred Savage and Danica McKellar were entering puberty. In a normal childhood, this is a deeply private and awkward time. But for these two teenagers, their physical and emotional changes were broadcast to millions of people every single week. The television network realized they could immediately monetize this awkwardness. They wrote scripts about teenage jealousy, physical insecurities, and the heavy emotional weight of growing up. The audience loved the new direction. They felt they were watching two real teenagers navigate life. But the reality on the soundstage was becoming deeply fractured and incredibly dangerous. Fred was no longer a cute little boy who simply memorized lines and hit his marks. He was a wealthy teenager who suddenly understood the exact mechanics of the television industry. He looked around the set and realized that the adult executives were terrified of him. He knew that if he walked off the floor, the entire production would shut down and millions of dollars of advertising revenue would be lost in a matter of hours. This realization of absolute corporate power completely corrupted his behavior. He began to test his boundaries right on the studio floor. He started to speak down to the adult crew members. He demanded constant changes to the shooting schedule. He treated the lighting technicians, the makeup artists, and the camera operators not as colleagues, but as his own personal servants. Danica was standing right next to him during all of this. Because the script demanded that Kevin and Winnie be together in almost every major scene, Danica was forced to be a silent, constant witness to Fred's growing hostility. When the cameras stopped rolling, she did not get to retreat to a private dressing room. She was kept on the floor next to her co-star while the crew adjusted the heavy equipment. She stood in her costume and watched Fred berate adult professionals over minor inconveniences. She saw the seasoned directors look the other way, stare at their shoes, and pretend nothing was happening. This dynamic created a crushing psychological burden for Danica. She was a young woman from a regular background. Her family relied heavily on the steady, massive income from her television contract. She was highly intelligent, and she knew she was entirely replaceable in the eyes of the network. If she spoke up and defended the crew members, she would instantly be labeled a difficult actress. The network could easily write Winnie Cooper out of the script, send her character to another town, and completely destroy her career. She was trapped by her financial needs and a ruthless, legally binding contract. She learned very quickly that survival in Hollywood meant keeping your mouth shut and protecting the leading man at all costs. So she developed a severe survival mechanism. She completely separated her real emotions from her physical actions. When the director called for action, she would look at Fred and project absolute convincing warmth. She would hold his hand, smile, and deliver her lines with perfect innocence. The audience sitting at home saw a girl deeply in love with a gentle boy. But the exact moment the director called cut, Danica would retreat into herself. She stood silently beside a teenage boy who was actively making the workplace miserable for everyone else in the room. She became a captive in the toxic kingdom Fred was allowed to build. The network executives were entirely complicit in this daily nightmare. They frequently visited the set and saw the hostile environment firsthand. They heard their leading man screaming at the crew in the hallways. But they also saw Danica standing quietly beside him, playing the role of the perfect, supportive girlfriend. The executives cynically used Danica's silence as proof that everything was manageable. They reasoned that if the environment was truly toxic, the sweet girl next door would formally complain to human resources. They used her quiet professionalism as a corporate shield to justify their own cowardice. They outright refused to discipline their star because the syndication revenue was simply too high to risk a confrontation. Fred's psychological trauma was completely different from Danica's, but it was equally destructive to the people around him. He was a teenager who had been completely stripped of normal moral boundaries. The adults in his life had failed him by consistently choosing profit over discipline. They handed a child a blank check and absolute unchecked authority. When a teenager is never told no, they do not develop empathy for the working class people around them. They develop cruelty. Fred lashed out at the crew because the system explicitly taught him that the crew was beneath him. He was a product manufactured by corporate greed, and he was operating exactly as the brutal Hollywood system allowed him to. This extreme contrast between the two stars created a heavy, suffocating tension on the set. They were legally bound together by the script. They spent more time with each other than they did with their own families. But there was no genuine friendship between them. There was only a forced corporate marriage. Danica silently resented Fred for the hostile, unpredictable environment he created. Fred resented the crew and anyone who did not immediately bow to his daily demands. Yet they had to stare into each other's eyes every single day and pretend to be adolescent soulmates. The emotional manipulation required to pull this off day after day was staggering. Danica had to actively suppress her own disgust and anxiety to deliver a convincing romantic performance. She was selling a pure, untainted love story to the American public while standing in the middle of a toxic, verbally abusive workplace. The crew members began to walk on eggshells around the main couple. They were terrified of triggering one of Fred's public outbursts. The television set was no longer a place of creative collaboration. It was a cold dictatorship ruled by a teenage boy, and Danica was forced to serve as his smiling public ambassador. The television network executives genuinely thought they could maintain this volatile situation indefinitely. They believed that as long as they kept paying everyone massive salaries, the crew would silently endure the abuse and Danica would maintain the romantic illusion for the cameras. They assumed they had built a perfect, closed corporate system where money bought absolute silence. But a dictatorship built on bullying eventually pushes someone too far. The network had surrounded their teenage king with people who were desperate to keep their jobs. But they were about to hire a new crew member who did not care about the Hollywood hierarchy. They were about to bring a woman onto the set who would absolutely refuse to accept the daily abuse. That single hiring decision would ignite a legal war and trigger the violent destruction of the entire billion-dollar empire. The breaking point for the television network arrived in the early months of 1993. The daily routine on a television set is incredibly repetitive. The actors go through hours of hair, makeup, and wardrobe fittings before they ever step onto the soundstage under the bright lights. For a teenage boy operating with absolute unchecked corporate power, the closed doors of a wardrobe fitting room presented an opportunity to exert complete control. This is where Monique Long, a 31-year-old professional costumer, entered the highly toxic ecosystem. Monique was hired to manage the daily costumes for the young cast. She was a working-class professional, simply trying to execute her job in a high-pressure industry. When she walked into the fitting rooms, she treated Fred Savage like a normal teenager who needed to put his clothes on and get to the set on time. She did not treat him like a Hollywood deity. For a young star who had spent the last 5 years surrounded by adults terrified of upsetting him, this standard professional boundary felt like an unacceptable insult to his ego. Fred reacted to this perceived disrespect with immediate and severe hostility. He began a calculated campaign of harassment during the daily wardrobe fittings. He used his physical presence and his untouchable status to intimidate her. The daily interactions devolved into severe verbal degradation. He crossed strict professional and physical boundaries, secure in the absolute knowledge that he was the star of a billion-dollar franchise, and she was just a replaceable employee. He tested the limits of his power, pushing further each day to see if any adult in the building would dare to stop him. Danica McKellar was acutely aware of the shifting temperature on the set. She did not have to be inside the wardrobe room to feel the highly volatile energy Fred brought to the soundstage immediately after those fittings. They were contractually bound together for almost every scene. When Fred walked onto the floor, carrying the arrogant energy of a boy who had just successfully bullied a crew member, Danica was the one forced to stand opposite him. The script required her to look deeply into his eyes and deliver lines filled with pure, innocent affection. The psychological toll this exact dynamic took on Danica is difficult to overstate. She was a deeply professional young woman who relied heavily on her massive television income to support her family and secure her future. She knew exactly what kind of hostile environment Fred was creating for the working-class crew members, but she was entirely trapped. She was forced into a state of daily emotional dissociation. She had to swallow her own disgust and anxiety. She had to reach out, take the hand of a boy who was actively terrorizing the workplace, and sell a beautiful, flawless romance to millions of viewers. The network was essentially paying a teenage girl to absorb the toxic fallout of their leading man and convert it into a profitable, heartwarming product. Monique Long did what any professional operating in a normal corporate structure is trained to do when faced with severe workplace harassment. She went directly up the chain of command. She took her complaints to the adult producers and the network executives running the show. She detailed the harassment, the hostile environment, and the daily abuse of power she was suffering at the hands of the teenage star. She genuinely believed that the adults in the room would fulfill their legal and moral obligations, step in, discipline the boy, and restore a safe working environment for the crew. She fundamentally misunderstood the cold, mathematical cruelty of the Hollywood corporate system. When Monique brought her complaints to the highest levels of the network, the executives did not see a vulnerable female employee asking for basic workplace protection. They saw a massive, terrifying financial liability threatening their most profitable asset. They looked at the teenage boy who generated billions of dollars in future syndication rights, and they looked at the 31-year-old costumer who could be replaced with a single phone call. The executives ran the numbers in their boardrooms. Disciplining Fred meant halting production, generating massive negative press, and potentially ruining the Golden Boy image that the entire network relied upon for advertising revenue. The corporate decision was immediate, ruthless, and entirely bloodless. Instead of protecting the victim and addressing the severe behavioral issues of their star, the network decided to completely erase the problem. They fired Monique Long. They threw her off the studio lot, confiscated her security pass, and believed that removing her physical presence would magically make the liability disappear. They thought they had successfully swept another mess under the rug to protect their billion-dollar franchise. They were disastrously wrong. Getting fired for reporting workplace abuse completely shattered Monique's faith in the Hollywood system, but it also permanently freed her from the network's control. She refused to pack up and walk away quietly. In a move that sent absolute shockwaves through the highest levels of the American broadcasting industry, Monique Long secured legal representation and officially filed a massive lawsuit against Fred Savage in a civil court. The exact moment the lawsuit hit the public record, the ticking time bomb the network had ignored for 5 years finally detonated. The allegations of severe harassment, physical intimidation, and verbal abuse were suddenly available for any journalist to read. The story immediately leaked to the national press, and the dynamic on the sound stage completely fractured. The protective bubble that had insulated Fred Savage from the real world instantly popped. For Fred, the reality of the lawsuit was a terrifying collision with a system he could not control. He had spent his entire adolescence believing he was untouchable. The network had explicitly taught him that his actions had no consequences. Now he was facing a judge, a furious press corps, and the very real possibility of his career being completely destroyed before he even reached adulthood. The panic on the set was palpable. The arrogant, untouchable boy was suddenly a massive legal liability, terrified of the cameras that had worshipped him for years. The executives were plunged into an unprecedented state of absolute panic. The very foundation of their empire was built exclusively on the pure, uncorrupted American innocence that Fred Savage represented. If the viewing public suddenly saw him not as the sweet, nostalgic boy next door, but as a hostile, entitled abuser facing a courtroom judge, the entire television illusion would instantly collapse. The advertisers would flee, the syndication deals would evaporate, and the network would lose its core revenue stream. Faced with this massive crisis, the executives did not launch an internal investigation to uncover the truth of the harassment. They launched a highly aggressive, deeply cynical public relations war to protect their money. Their immediate strategy was one of total distraction, and the primary weapon they chose to deploy was Danica McKellar. The network realized that the only thing more powerful than a Hollywood scandal was a Hollywood romance. They desperately needed the public to stop looking at the legal documents and start looking back at the television screen. Danica found herself thrust directly onto the front lines of a massive corporate cover-up. The network publicists immediately scheduled more photo shoots, more wholesome magazine interviews, and pushed the writers to lean even harder into the sentimental romance scripts between Kevin and Winnie. Danica was forced to serve as a human shield for a boy who had just been publicly exposed for abusing his power. The psychological demand placed on her during this period was entirely suffocating. She knew exactly what was happening in the legal department. She had witnessed the hostile environment on the soundstage firsthand. Yet, she was contractually obligated to smile for the cameras, hold his hand even tighter, and sell the illusion of a perfect, innocent first love to the American public. While highly paid corporate lawyers were aggressively maneuvering to bury allegations of severe workplace harassment, Fred and Danica were standing under the studio lights, filming scenes about school dances and the fragile beauty of teenage romance. The network forced her to look into the eyes of a co-star who was actively fighting a massive legal battle regarding his treatment of women, and project absolute, pure adoration. She was trapped in a golden cage, heavily relied upon by a billion-dollar corporation to maintain a massive lie so they could protect their profit margins. The survival of the franchise rested almost entirely on her ability to fake it. The innocent romance of Kevin and Winnie was now fully underwritten by hush money, corporate intimidation, and the silent suffering of a teenage girl forced to protect her abuser. While Danica McKellar was being pushed directly in front of the television cameras to serve as a smiling human shield, the legal department at the network went to work behind heavily guarded doors. The corporate executives deployed a team of elite, high-priced lawyers to handle the harassment lawsuit. The mandate given to these lawyers was incredibly clear and entirely ruthless. They were not hired to defend Fred Savage in a court of law or to uncover the truth about his behavior. They were hired to ensure that he never set foot inside a courtroom. The network knew that a public trial would be an absolute death sentence for their television program. If the lawsuit went to trial, the press would be allowed into the room. The working-class wardrobe costumer would take the stand and testify about the daily degradation she suffered. Even worse, Fred Savage would be forced to sit in the witness box under oath. The media would broadcast daily updates about the ugly, entitled behavior of America's favorite boy next door. The carefully constructed, wholesome illusion would be violently shattered in front of a jury and millions of viewers. The corporate executives recognized that a trial could not be won, because even if they somehow secured a technical legal victory, the catastrophic damage to the brand's reputation would be permanent. The advertisers would immediately pull their funding, and the syndication deals would vanish. To prevent this financial nightmare, the corporate machine utilized the oldest and most effective tactic in the entertainment industry. They used their massive financial resources to completely suffocate the truth. The network lawyers approached the legal team representing the fired wardrobe worker and initiated negotiations for a rapid, out-of-court settlement. They did not negotiate because Fred was innocent. They negotiated because his image was far too valuable to the corporation to let it fail. They placed a massive sum of money on the table. But that money came with absolute, non-negotiable conditions. The settlement was designed specifically to buy total silence. In exchange for the financial payout, the victim was forced to sign incredibly strict non-disclosure agreements. These legal documents bound her to permanent silence under the threat of severe financial ruin. She was legally forbidden from ever discussing the harassment, the toxic environment on the set, or the details of the settlement with the press, the public, or anyone else. The television network effectively purchased the absolute suppression of the truth. The lawsuit was quietly dismissed, the legal files were sealed away in corporate vaults, and the entire incident was instantly wiped from the public record. The successful execution of this financial cover-up sent a chilling, unmistakable message to everyone working on the soundstage. For Fred Savage, the settlement was the ultimate dangerous validation of his worst instincts. He watched the massive corporate machine completely crush an adult woman just to protect him. The system definitively proved to him that he was truly untouchable. He learned the darkest lesson Hollywood has to offer. You can engage in hostile, abusive behavior, and a team of men in expensive suits will simply write a massive check to make the consequences disappear. His ego, already inflated by years of enabling, swelled to completely unmanageable proportions. He walked back onto the studio floor believing he was a god who existed entirely above the law. For Danica McKellar, the resolution of the lawsuit made the working environment feel even more terrifying and suffocating. She had watched the corporate machine completely destroy a vulnerable female employee. She knew with absolute certainty that she was entirely on her own. If she ever complained about the hostile environment, or if she ever refused to participate in the ongoing romantic marketing campaign, she knew the network would not hesitate to silence her too. She was forced to continue acting out the great American love story, deeply aware that the innocent romance of Kevin and Winnie was now fully underwritten by hush money and corporate intimidation. The psychological burden of looking into Fred's eyes, knowing he had just successfully bought his way out of a harassment scandal, was immense. The network had saved their golden boy from the legal system, but in doing so, they permanently poisoned the very foundation of the show. However, in the heavily guarded executive boardrooms of the television network, the atmosphere was entirely different. The corporate suits were not celebrating their legal victory. Once the settlement was signed and the immediate public relations crisis was averted, they sat down and ran a cold mathematical risk assessment. They looked down at their teenage star and realized the fundamental reality of their business had completely changed. Fred Savage was no longer just a highly profitable television asset. He was a massive, unpredictable legal liability. The network executives understood the psychology of the monster they had created. They had spent years refusing to discipline him, and they had just paid a small fortune to hide his behavior. They knew that his deeply ingrained sense of entitlement was only going to escalate now that he felt completely invincible. The executives realized it was only a matter of time before he crossed the line again and attacked another crew member. If a second lawsuit was filed, the media would inevitably uncover the first secret settlement. The entire family-friendly brand would be obliterated overnight, the parent company would face massive legal exposure, and the executives themselves would face severe professional consequences. The mathematical risk of keeping the franchise alive simply outweighed the financial reward. The machine had reached its breaking point. The executives made a brutal, bloodless corporate decision. They decided to permanently execute the television program. They did not call Fred and Danica into a respectful meeting to gently break the news. There was no gratitude for the two young actors who had built the billion-dollar nostalgia machine and carried the network for 6 years. The network simply pulled the plug in the middle of the night. The cast and crew were abruptly informed that the current season would be their absolute last, and production would shut down almost immediately. There would be no farewell tour, no final full season to properly wrap up the storylines, and no time to prepare for the end of their childhood careers. For Fred Savage, this sudden cancellation was a massive, disorienting shock. His entire kingdom was instantly dismantled. The corporate machine that had protected him, fed his ego, and shielded him from the consequences of his actions for 6 years, completely abandoned him overnight. He was no longer the untouchable king of the studio lot. He was suddenly just an unemployed teenager holding a script that was about to expire. The system had used him to generate massive wealth, and the exact second he became too dangerous and expensive to manage, they threw him away without a second thought. The absolute power he thought he held was revealed to be nothing more than a temporary corporate lease. For Danica McKellar, the abrupt end brought a highly complicated wave of emotions. She was losing the steady job that had defined her teenage years and provided massive financial security for her family. But beneath the professional uncertainty, there was a profound, silent, overwhelming relief. She was being permanently freed from a deeply toxic work environment. She no longer had to act as a human shield for the network executives. She no longer had to pretend to be deeply in love with a co-star who operated with unchecked hostility off camera. She was finally escaping the golden cage that had trapped her for years. But before she could leave the studio lot for good and reclaim her own life, the network executives forced her to participate in one final, massive deception. They needed to craft an ending to the story that would completely distract the public from the sudden, suspicious cancellation, and they were going to use the romance of Kevin and Winnie one last time to pull off the greatest lie in television history. Because the cancellation was executed with such brutal corporate efficiency, the writing staff was left in an impossible situation. They did not have the luxury of a final season to gradually close the story of Kevin and Winnie. They were handed a sudden, non-negotiable deadline by the legal department. The writers knew that the entire global appeal of the television program rested completely on the pure romance between the two teenage characters. The viewing audience desperately wanted the childhood sweethearts to stay together forever, but the network executives needed an emergency exit. They needed an ending that felt so final, so emotionally absolute, that the public would accept the sudden conclusion without asking uncomfortable questions about why their favorite show was being yanked off the air. The solution the writers engineered to solve this corporate problem remains the greatest artistic deception in television history. They bypassed the live-action scenes entirely for the final resolution. They did not write a scene where Fred Savage and Danica McKellar break up on screen. Filming to break up would require time, rehearsals, and money that the network was no longer willing to spend. Instead, they used a cheap, fast, and entirely controlled method. They used a pre-recorded voiceover. As the camera showed a nostalgic parade, the disembodied voice of the older narrator calmly explained to the audience that Kevin and Winnie stayed friends, but they never got married. They simply went their separate ways. The writers crafted a bittersweet, slightly sad ending that completely subverted the expectations of the viewing public. When the final episode aired in 1993, the corporate trap worked flawlessly. Millions of viewers sat in their living rooms across America and Britain and cried openly. They watched Fred and Danica share their final moments on screen, and they genuinely believed they were witnessing a profound piece of art. The television critics universally praised the writers for their bravery. They printed reviews stating that the ending was a realistic, mature reflection on the harsh truth that first love rarely survives into adulthood. They called it a masterpiece of television writing that elevated a simple family sitcom into high drama. The public had absolutely no idea that this beautiful artistic ending was a complete and total fabrication. The writers did not separate Kevin and Winnie to teach the audience a profound lesson about growing up and moving on. They separated the characters because the network executives were terrified of a sexual harassment lawsuit. The executives successfully used the genuine tears of their audience to completely wash away the reality of the toxic workplace environment. They manipulated the deepest, most nostalgic emotions of millions of people to execute a flawless corporate cover-up. Danica McKellar had to sit back and watch the public praise this ending as a beautiful tragedy. She knew the unvarnished truth. She knew the bittersweet farewell was not high art. It was just a frantic patch job ordered by panicked executives who needed to run away from a scandal. She watched the network successfully use the pure, innocent image of Winnie Cooper one last time to protect their corporate balance sheet. The show faded to black. The studio doors were permanently locked, and the audience was left holding on to a beautiful, touching memory that was entirely manufactured to hide an incredibly dark reality. For 25 years, a heavy, unbroken silence hung over the legacy of the program. Fred Savage and Danica McKellar grew up and went their separate ways, moving far beyond the confines of the studio lot that had defined their childhoods. Fred transitioned into a highly successful career as a television director. He stayed firmly embedded within the Hollywood system, simply moving from in front of the camera to behind it, where he maintained a position of authority and power. Danica took a completely different path. She stepped entirely away from the toxic, manipulative machinery of the entertainment industry. She attended university, studied mathematics, and built a deeply respected academic career. She chose a life built on logic and hard facts, leaving behind a world built entirely on emotional manipulation. But no matter how far they traveled or what they achieved as adults, the ghost of their childhood television romance followed them everywhere. Whenever they gave interviews or met the public, the fans only wanted to talk about Kevin and Winnie. The audience still mourned the tragic, beautiful ending of the show. The corporate cover-up had worked so perfectly that for a quarter of a century, the public continued to praise the network for its artistic brilliance. The executives who had orchestrated the massive lie had long since retired, taking their millions of dollars with them. They left the two former child stars to quietly carry the heavy burden of the illusion. But the entertainment industry is built on shifting sands, and corporate secrets are incredibly difficult to keep buried forever. By 2018, the cultural tide in Hollywood had fundamentally changed. A massive industry-wide movement regarding workplace abuse and harassment was sweeping through the studios. The old unspoken rules of silence and intimidation that had protected powerful men for decades were finally beginning to crumble. The systems that had protected Fred Savage when he was a teenager were suddenly under intense public scrutiny. It was during this unprecedented period of exposure that the carefully constructed facade of America's favorite nostalgic comedy was permanently shattered. Allie Mills, the actress who had played the warm, loving mother on the program, decided she could no longer keep the dark secret of the studio lot. She sat down for a media interview and completely blew the lid off the 1993 cover-up. She did not use careful public relations language. She spoke with absolute, unvarnished clarity. She publicly confirmed everything the network had spent millions of dollars trying to hide. She stated directly to the press that the harassment lawsuit filed by the wardrobe worker against Fred Savage was the absolute singular reason the network abruptly executed the program. She stripped away the artistic excuses and the lies about declining ratings. The truth was finally out in the open. The sweet, innocent television show had been shut down because the working environment created by its leading teenage star had become a massive, unmanageable legal nightmare. This revelation sent absolute shockwaves through the generation that had grown up watching the show. For the viewers sitting at home, people who were now in their 50s and 60s, the news was a devastating, deeply personal betrayal. They looked back at their own memories of the program. They remembered the tears they had shed during the series finale. They remembered feeling deeply moved by the narrator, explaining that Kevin and Winnie did not end up together. Now, staring at the cold, hard facts of the lawsuit, the audience realized that their genuine emotional reactions had been entirely manipulated. The network had harvested their tears to launder a toxic workplace. The beautiful, bittersweet ending was not a masterpiece of television writing. It was a frantic emergency escape hatch built by panicked corporate lawyers to get their golden boy off the hook. The public finally understood the true depth of the psychological manipulation Danica McKellar had been subjected to. Looking back at those final episodes with the knowledge of the lawsuit, the audience could suddenly see the incredibly dark reality operating right beneath the surface of the screen. Danica was not just playing the role of a sweet, understanding girlfriend. She had been actively used by a billion-dollar corporation as a human shield. The network had forced a teenage girl to stand under the hot studio lights, hold the hand of an accused abuser, and sell a story of pure, untainted love to the entire world. They had weaponized her innocence to distract the press and protect their balance sheets. The invisible, crushing weight she had carried for the final years of the production was finally visible to everyone. For Fred Savage, the unearthing of the truth was a harsh collision with reality. The system had protected him perfectly when he was a teenager. The network executives had taught him that he could treat working-class crew members with absolute hostility and simply write a check to make the consequences disappear. He had spent his entire adult life operating under the assumption that his golden boy image was bulletproof. But the 2018 revelation proved that the consequences of his actions had simply been delayed. The public finally saw through the sincere eyes and the nostalgic smile. They saw a man who had abused his immense corporate privilege when he was just a boy, creating a hostile environment that ultimately destroyed the jobs of hundreds of innocent crew members when the show was forced to shut down. The Hollywood machine had successfully saved his career in the 1990s, but it could not protect his legacy from the eventual, undeniable truth. We invite these television programs into our homes because we want to feel something genuine. We invest our time, our emotions, and our trust into these characters, hoping to find a comforting reflection of our own lives and our own youth. The ultimate tragedy of this specific Hollywood romance is not that the two characters went their separate ways at the end of the story. The true lasting tragedy is that the television network took something universally pure, the fragile and awkward beauty of first love, and turned it into a heavy, suffocating curtain to hide their own corporate corruption. The executives sitting in their boardrooms knew exactly how much the American public loved that young couple. They knew the audience trusted them, and they calculatedly weaponized that love and that trust to avoid a scandal. This history forces us to look at the entertainment industry with a much colder, more forensic eye. The deeply moving moments that make us cry in our living rooms are frequently the exact currency the studios use to buy their way out of legal trouble. Danica McKellar and Fred Savage were just children when they were pushed into the center of this massive machine, but they were forced to operate within a ruthless, unfeeling monopoly. The history of classic television is built entirely on these beautiful, highly profitable lies. As we unpack these stories and look closely at the timelines, we reclaim the truth from the public relations machines. We stop seeing the actors as perfect, nostalgic characters, and we start seeing them as real people surviving a brutal corporate system. There are many more dark secrets buried under the bright lights of our favorite childhood shows, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Until we open the next file, remember that the most touching, innocent moments broadcast on your screen are very often designed specifically to make you look away from the shadows.